Thanks. Welcome to our AI seminar meeting. Today I have a pleasure of introducing a namesake of mine, Kristina Gligorić, who is a postdoctoral scholar at Stanford University, Computer Science Department. She's actually working in Dan Juravsky's group, who will describe most really well. Previously, she obtained her PhD in computer science at EPFL in Bob West's group, another favorite researchers of ours. Her research focuses on developing computational approaches to address societal issues, drawing from methods from NLP and causal inference. Her work has been published in top computer science conferences focused on computational social science and social media, natural language processing, and a broad audience journals such as Nature Communications and Nature Medicine. She is a Swiss National Science Foundation Fellow and University of Chicago Rising Star in Data Science. She received awards for her work, including EPFL Thesis Distinction and CSCW Best Paper Honorable Mention Award. So please join me in welcoming Kristina to our AI seminar.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much for the introduction. I'm very excited to tell you all a bit about my recent work on AI for fostering constructive online conversations. So in recent years, we've seen NLP systems achieve really remarkable advancements, and things that we thought would be impossible suddenly became possible. And this now really promises to disrupt society by applying these tools to high-stakes domains, such as education, where perhaps AI could transform the classroom just like the calculator did, to healthcare, where maybe Google AI has better bedside manners than real doctors, and also content moderation, where the goal is to keep our online spaces safe. But then at the same time, current NLP systems, current LLMs are also limited in some important ways, and applying them out of the box to these impactful domains could be challenging. And some important issues have been repeatedly observed, such as factuality, where there are issues with hallucinations or source attributions, bias, racial bias, gender bias. And then also, I wanted to highlight this ability to persuade humans despite suffering from these limitations, such as factuality and bias. And all these limitations can lead to societal harms if we're not careful about it, and then also ultimately not fulfilling these ambitious potential promises. So in my work recently, I've been interested in this specific question of how could we identify and address harms when developing AI for social good? And then if we can do that, if we can address these harms, if we could mitigate them, how could we help humans do some of the most complex and most challenging tasks that we are doing? And so in this talk today, I will first talk about AI for enabling constructive conversations about race. Then in the second part, I will talk about enabling constructive counterspeech. And both of these have to do with content moderation, so the domain of online content moderation. But then in the third part, I'll talk about some other domains, such as education or emotional support and sustainability, where also humans are doing these complex tasks, and there are similar opportunities and challenges in helping them. So I'll talk a bit about bigger picture and some of the future directions. So let's dive in, first talking about constructive conversations about race. And I wanted to start with a warning that some of the content in this talk could be offensive, and especially some of the examples that I'm about to show. And this is joint work with my wonderful collaborators at Stanford that will soon be published. So I'm interested in content moderation as it relates to social media in particular. And here, social media really emerged as these new spaces that could be our generation's digital town square, that can host discussions, spark debates, and even lead to societal change. And social media also offer a platform for everyone, including minority voices, to describe their lived experiences and disclose their experiences. And In the past, we've seen this successfully even lead to societal change in the case of social justice movements such as #MeToo or Living While Black. But then at the same time, social media might serve as a source of online harassment. And it is, again, those minority voices that disproportionately bear the burden of these negative online experiences. So notice how Pew reports that women are twice as likely as men to say that the most recent incident of online harassment was very upsetting. And to address this, both researchers and social media companies engage in content moderation, where the goal is to keep online spaces safe and inclusive for everyone. And then if we think about it, content moderation is one domain where there's some big challenges and big opportunities to use AI to address these issues. So content moderations that problems that AI could solve include, first, this massive amounts of content. So only in 2023, close to 5 billion people were online, but then the number of available moderators is by many orders of magnitude smaller than that. And so maybe LLMs could help us, go through all of that content. Human moderators also typically lack support and lack resources, but then they face the psychological burden of being exposed to all this bad content. So perhaps LLMs could be used as part of training or practicing or developing their skills. And then also this question of having a proactive response, where when humans do moderation, it's always by definition delayed once the content is already out there and the damage is already done, but maybe these systems could have a more proactive response. But then again, paradoxically, there is growing concern that this content moderation might discriminate against marginalized voices. So notice how on Facebook, Black users report feeling censored when talking about racism. On TikTok, it has been reported that algorithms disadvantage Black creators. And these kinds of outcomes are consequential, these kinds of false positives in content moderation, because multiple flags can lead to account suspension, content down, and isolating people from their social networks. And indeed, we see that on Instagram, Black users report being 50% more likely to face account suspension. And these issues that minority voices face online have been reported in general. However, today I want to talk about one specific problem that my collaborators and I identified, and these are racial discrimination disclosures. So disclosures of personal or close others' experiences with discrimination and inequality. So what do I mean by that? So we can see in this example, there is a user sharing that they were racially profiled in their neighborhood, where a woman asked, why were you there on a property that's not hers? And then they say that they are a Black man and that they felt targeted because of this encounter. And now we want to support these kinds of disclosures because they can foster empathy, start discussions, and even lead to societal change. But we worry, because of these reports about bias moderation, that minority voices might be silenced when sharing experiences with racism and discrimination. And we need to quantify these harms and solve this issue. So the questions that I'm interested in are, how do we quantify harmful silencing? And how do we ensure online community safety without perpetuating bias? So in this first part, to address this issue, I'll talk about how we compiled a large new data set of racial discrimination disclosures, and then designed and conducted a set of studies to identify this silencing, measure its impact, and try to solve this issue through an intervention. So the disclosures that we collected are all posted within local online social networks. So imagine that you recently moved to a new area, like I moved to Bay Area, this like wonderful tech bubble, and you want to connect with people locally. And there are many platforms that allow you to offer help, get help, connect and network locally. So I might join the Bay Area Discord channel, I might join Bay Area Facebook group or Reddit groups, or I might look up events in local meetup communities or Eventbrite communities, and many other platforms allow you to connect locally in that way. So we partnered with one such platform used across all the US states. And then through a mix of manual and automated coding, we compiled this new data set of racial discrimination disclosures posted within local communities. So here we can see another example where a user is writing about how their brother-in-law was walking with siblings, and then a truck pulled up and 3 men got out of the truck and they swore at the brother and at the children. And then for every such post, we also have metadata about the user who posted, about where it was posted, and then also how other users responded, including did other users or moderators flag this as toxic or uncivil. So the first question that I'm interested in is, how do automated methods and humans treat racial discrimination disclosures? And here I'm going to show you that there is a problem because these disclosures describe very negative race-related experiences. My hypothesis is that both algorithms and human flagging decisions could attempt to silence by flagging them as toxic. So to test if this is the case, we tested every major publicly available and frequently used toxicity detection algorithm, such as Roberta model fine-tuned on toxicity detection task, Detoxify, different variants of Perspective, OpenAI's moderation API, and then also different versions of ChatGPT. And asking this question, we found that indeed, if we look into the percentage of racial discrimination disclosures flagged as toxic, a large fraction is flagged, with the percentage ranging between 5 and 60%. And importantly, even the most recent models that show improved performance on important tasks flag these constructive narratives about personal experiences as toxic. Now, this is a troubling result. But you may be wondering, perhaps this has nothing to do with race. These are very negative posts, and maybe they get flagged because they are so negative and so charged. So to test if this is the case, we also compiled a second data set of disclosures of personal experiences that don't have anything to do with race. So notice how in this example, the user is writing about having a negative experience with another neighbor who was throwing broken branches in their yard. And the neighbor wouldn't cooperate and he was being very rude. But here, the race of the neighbor is not stated. And also the entire incident doesn't appear to be racially motivated in any way. Yeah.
I'm sorry, can I ask really quickly? I imagine that disclosures are not like the most common posts on social media.
Yeah.
How do you compile these two data sets?
Yeah, okay, so we started from like a random sample and we looked for keywords where there were like personal entities like me or like my sister or my close family member. And we also looked for keywords that have to do with race. And keywords such as discrimination. And then, so starting from this larger set, we did manual annotation. So it is manually verified that all of this, yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so that's how we compile the control data set. And then if this had nothing to do with race, you would expect that these negative experiences are about equally flagged. But we see that that's not the case. So across all these different models, racial discrimination disclosures are flagged significantly more than non-racial experiences, which suggests that race might be the dominant factor here because there is the gap between the two rates. And then if algorithms could flag personal disclosures as toxic, why does this happen? So here, my hypothesis was that perhaps all these different models overfit on affective lexical features where they don't take into account the nuances of the context, but instead just the fact that there are a lot of affective words would lead to flagging. So more concretely, a first hypothesis could be that perhaps the presence of swear words increases likelihood of flagging. And indeed, this post often contains swear words. So for example, here, the user is describing being sworn at and actually their identity being sworn at, but the swear word is still there. So perhaps that causes flagging. Similarly, perhaps negative emotion also increases likelihood of flagging. These posts often have charged language. So here a user is writing about being tired and sick and the whole situation being disgusting, which are very negative words. So that might lead to more flagging. And then another way to test that is to look the other way around. So perhaps positive words, such as saying, I'm very open and proud, and I have a unique opportunity to make a difference. So perhaps such positive words would decrease likelihood of flagging. So to test these three hypotheses, we fitted logistic regression models that predict probability of flagging based on the text of the posts. And then we saw that indeed affective lexical features do drive algorithmic flagging. So across all the models, swear words and negative emotions marked in red increase likelihood of flagging, so they have a positive coefficient, whereas positive emotion the other way around decreases likelihood of flagging. And again, here, even the most recent models rely on these features such as swear words and negative emotion, similarly like previous models. Yeah.
Sorry, quick question. So you're trying to compare positive emotion, tweets that contain or posts that contain positive emotion to swear words?
Yeah.
Was there any, or a subset of posts that had positive emotions but were toxic? I don't know how, I don't have an example in mind, but if it was toxic but did have positive emotion, did it get flagged?
Yes, so all of these posts describe personal experiences with racism. So for us, by definition, this discourse is constructive and desirable. So it could be that some annotate, and we will see later how humans annotate these posts, which I think will answer your question better. But here we just looked at swear words and emotion and tried to control for confounding factors you could think of, such as length and other textual features. But I'll show later what humans think about these posts. Okay.
And just a question, what algorithms, methods did you use for emotion detection?
Oh, that's a good question. So we were experimenting with different models. In the end, because it's like social media posts, we use either positive emotion and negative.
Oh, just kind of sentiment.
Yes. Okay. And then, so if this is a case where swear words increase likelihood of flagging, another more specific hypothesis to test could be that perhaps these models don't distinguish use from mention. So we can use swear words to actively offend someone, but we could also mention them, like in these posts, to disclose being sworn at. And these are two very different things that should be treated differently. But then for some of the models, such as Roberta shown here, swear words increase likelihood of flagging, regardless of whether they are used or mentioned. And so here, for example, this must be a nuance that humans should be able to make. So that raises a question, how do humans do on this task, and how do humans treat racial discrimination disclosures? So we looked into the users of this platform, and we saw that although flagging is relatively rare on the platform, so less than 2% of all posts get flagged, human flagging is very frequent, and over 30% of these disclosures get flagged by human users of the platform. So this might challenge the assumption that humans would somehow be more understanding and be capable to take into account the context. But still, if we want to fix this issue, we should understand what humans are doing. So first, humans also flag racial discrimination disclosures significantly more than negative experience disclosures. And we might ask, why is this happening? So why do humans flag racial discrimination disclosures? And if we can understand, we can also fix it. And then we could get better annotations, better data to train our models. We might also want to do like human in the loop kind of thing. And here my hypothesis was that so humans shouldn't over-rely on effective lexical features, but instead, perhaps more intricate in-group and out-group dynamics could explain human behaviors in this context. So what do I mean by that? So in particular, following the concept of social identity threat, when there are mentions of explicitly calling out white people, for example, that could increase social identity threat and lead to more flagging. So in this example, the user is disclosing how the grandson was approached by a white lady who kept asking if they lived there. So here, a reader might worry about being associated with the discriminatory behavior. So a reader might think, does this post reflect badly on all the white ladies? And does this post reflect badly on me, a white lady? And in that way, this kind of language could increase social identity threat and lead to more flagging. Then the other way around, following the concept of psychological belonging, when there are community credentials in these disclosures, that might bring people closer together and decrease likelihood of flagging. So we can see how in this example, the user emphasized having lived there since they were 5, which might lead the reader to be more willing to empathize with the writer of the post, because of this shared identity of everyone being a member of the same community for a very long time. And then finally, a third hypothesis is related to tone policing. So literature describes that when individuals from one group are faced with social identity threat, they could start to engage in tone policing, where tone policing means that we critique the way how injustice is expressed rather than engaging with the injustice itself. And so following that concept, if this post has these strong charged words, such as being disgusted and the whole thing being horrible, these non-race related words could be used as a justification to take down race-related content. So following that, tone policing could also explain human flagging on this platform. So again, we fitted logistic regression models, and again, we modeled human flagging. Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand. The tone policing would be practiced as an outgroup to silence the outgroup?
Okay. Yes. Yes.
Not for in-group interactions.
No, so it would be like majority group members, which in US context would be white members of the community, silencing minority group members who are disclosing experiences with discrimination.
But it can also work in the reverse way, right?
Oh,
because
sure.
It's an outgroup.
Sure, it could. Yes. But I think we're capturing the other way here. Yes.
Can I also ask, like, your human annotators, were they, like, how diverse were they? And was there an in-group for the annotators that would have been different from, like, majority white? I'm sorry, like, were there annotators who were, like, the same race as the people who are posting and giving moderated stuff?
Yeah. So that's a great question. Here we model kind of aggregate on platform behavior. So you could assume that, so it's representative of US population. And so you could assume that it mirrors more the majority behavior. But then we did also experiments where we controlled who are the readers and tried to find that effect of the race of the reader. But I think these results don't speak to that, although it could be the case, and it would be interesting to look into that. Yeah.
Wait, so you did not control for annotator race?
No, because it's like all users on this platform.
Oh, I see.
Yes.
You didn't recruit annotators.
No.
I love this. I'm wondering if, did you do anything with the LLMs at all? See if there's any like implicit in-group, out-group biases within them?
Oh, that's a great question. So no, for LLMs, we only said like, let's use them as toxicity detection methods. Let's just prompt for toxicity. But it's a great idea that you could instead use LLMs to like role play as a simulated participant and then see if LLMs would reproduce this. And I think probably they would, or I would
think so,
yeah. I don't know. Yeah, perhaps it could be interesting.
I mean,
yeah.
We have work here done, and you can't teach LLMs to the in-group language to be part of in-group.
Oh no.
Yeah, I wish Becca was
gender
here.
queer.
Okay. Oh, interesting. Okay, then maybe not, but it could still be interesting to look into it. Yeah.
I would think that the LLMs themselves, like with the calling out whites thing, because like I guess with the Becca thing, I would think that because the LLMs, the charge that they see those words in are usually from like the out group where the in-group is the marginalized group, whereas here, I would think that the in-group would be the majority group. And so they would play into this. So I would think that we might replicate these results.
But there's symmetry to in-group, like. So.
Yeah, okay, that's fair.
It's hard to wrap the brain around
it's
that.
so weird.
Yeah, in some other settings, if we're using LLMs to annotate, it could work to specify like the demographic of the annotator, but then that also comes with risk of like stereotyping that demographic. So
let me see, is Becca here today?
Is there another question?
Yeah, I'm just curious. You mentioned this data set was compiled across several different platforms, and I'm just curious how many of those posts, like how is it distributed across those platforms? Do you find it's really heavily dominated by one or the other? Because I'm just interested in.
Yeah, so it's one platform, but then it's a lot of small communities within that platform distributed across the US states. Yeah, maybe we can do more questions by the end, but that's kind of the setting. It's one platform and many communities within the one platform. Okay, so then here we confirm that in-group and out-group dynamics do drive human flagging. And so far we saw that both algorithms and humans could silence minority voices, and for different reasons. But what is the impact of this? So what is the impact of racial discrimination disclosures being flagged as toxic? And here, my concrete hypothesis was that merely knowing about silencing could harm onlookers. So if onlookers know that personal narratives are silenced, they might feel a decreased sense of connection to the community. They might feel a decreased inclination to use the platform, and we might also see a decreased perception of the platform itself, which would be all very consequential outcomes where people would be less likely to engage with the communities or to use these platforms that could also be helpful for them. So to test if this is the case and to also get more controlled setting where we can recruit the participants, we conducted an impact study where we presented participants with a feed of a local social media community, such as Bay Area in this case. And then 300 participants were recruited to read this feed. And they were exposed to racial discrimination disclosures and non-race related experiences. And they were also exposed to flagging. And then we measured these outcomes, so their perception of the community and their perception of the platform. And then within the feed, we simulated this experience of knowing about silencing, such that below the post, we showed a banner saying, this post is being removed. A member reported it because they thought it violated the guidelines. And when you refresh the page, this post will be gone. Then asking, does silencing harm onlookers? We can look at the reported sense of connection to the community. So for example, after viewing a racial discrimination disclosure that is not flagged on a scale from 1 to 7, where 1 is completely disconnected and 7 is completely connected, participants reported feeling around 3.5, so kind of feeling neutral about the community. But then if they know that these narratives are flagged, there is a significant decrease in their sense of connection to the community. And then looking into non-race related experiences, we didn't see any effect of flagging, which shows that knowing about silencing of race related disclosures really decreases this connection to the community. And I think here, this shows that these kinds of false positives in content moderation are not some hypothetical harms or hypothetical risks, but that instead they can really tangibly impact onlookers and really decrease the sense of connection to the community and to the platform. So if this happens, so if both algorithms and humans could silence, and if this impacts people negatively, the next question is how could we intervene and how could we reduce the flagging of racial discrimination disclosures? To answer this, my hypothesis was that perhaps there is something wrong in these moderation guidelines where users on the platform or recruited participants are told to moderate and are told to annotate content somehow. So perhaps if we reframe these moderation guidelines, we could decrease flagging rates of racial discrimination disclosures. And to see if this is the case, we recruited another over 500 participants to serve this time as moderators, where they were shown posts. So they were shown again this feed, and then they were randomly assigned moderation guidelines. And then we monitored flagging rates among the different subsets of moderators. And so to be more precise, we started from common typical moderation guidelines. So this is just a summary, but such moderation guidelines would say, this is our moderation practice. Be respectful, do not discriminate, do not engage in harmful activity, and then more examples and explanations of what this could mean. But then informed by our findings about in-group and out-group dynamics, we revised these guidelines. And in particular, we revised them to say, yes, be respectful, but we prioritize content over tone, which is meant to decrease tone policing. Similarly, we revised to say, do not discriminate, yes, but we give neighbors a voice and we show support, which is meant to reduce social threat and focus on this collective identity of everyone being members of the same community. And so in that way, reframe to shift the focus away from yourself and your social threat and closer to the other and to the shared community membership. And then we monitored the effectiveness of this intervention by looking at flagging rate across the different conditions. So first, in conventional guidelines, among recruited participants, we again reproduced this result that 52% of them flagged racial discrimination disclosures as toxic. But then in the reframe guideline condition, there was significantly less flagging. So only 36% were flagged as toxic. And then interestingly, even a no guideline condition where participants are not encouraged to moderate actively also led to a decreased flagging rate, which to me really emphasizes that conventional guidelines can also put people in a punitive mindset where we overflag and we see nuanced borderline content as toxic. And currently, we are in the process of implementing this intervention on this platform. And I find that really exciting because it could impact millions of users.
Oh yeah, how about the true, like when you reframe your guideline, how about a true positive case?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I didn't include it on the slides, but so of course you would want your intervention to decrease false positives, but not impact true rates. And we also inserted like filler posts that we wanted to be detected, and there we didn't see any significant changes. So I think that was promising, but now in the process of like actually implementing it, it's something that we're monitoring, and there is definitely a trade-off. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
But here, does the moderator race matter? The identity of the moderators?
Yes, so here I didn't specify, but in this study, we actually recruited only white Americans. Yeah. Okay, cool. And I wanted to finish this part by saying that we identified this phenomenon and we saw that it has a negative impact on onlookers. And I think more broadly, this really highlights this triple jeopardy that marginalized people face online. So first, there is the direct harm of being exposed to negative racial experiences. Then there is the direct harm of biased moderation, where content is taken down, accounts are suspended. But the novel negative impact that we identify is this more indirect harm of merely witnessing biased moderation that can also tangibly impact people. And I've shown how reframing the guidelines can mitigate this issue among humans. But one open question remains, how could we reduce algorithmic silencing of constructive conversations about race? And here in particular, this situation where swear words lead to flagging even when they're mentioned and not only used, it seems like a very important limitation. And so we would want to address that. So in the next part, I'll talk a bit more broadly about this use mention distinction and how it relates to harmful online content in general. And this is again joint work with my collaborators at Stanford that will be presented next month. So in general, beyond personal disclosures, the use mention distinction refers to this difference between using words. So I can use the word bananas to say bananas have a peel versus mentioning words where I might say bananas has 7 letters, where I'm only mentioning the word bananas to talk about the number of letters, or I could quote someone, so I could say, Dan said bananas. And this distinction is very important when dealing with problematic language online. But in social media research and NLP, there are hundreds of papers focusing on use of this language, where we study when users state problematic language, for example, to express hate or to promote misinformation. But then this distinction is also really relevant to counter speech. So counter speech is speech produced to counteract harmful speech of others, to prevent its spread, to support the targets, or to support others who are joining in this effort. And counter speech might need to mention harmful content, but that doesn't mean that counter speech is harmful itself. And we would actually want to support counter speech because of its positive impacts. And I'm fascinated by this use mention distinction. I think it relates to counter speech, to personal disclosures, including eating disorders and communities that discuss eating disorders to support each other, but then also in media reporting. So for example, both media and academic reporting need to report on harmful content, but that doesn't make media reports harmful. And similarly, in legal settings, we might need to report and quote harmful content, but then legal proceedings are not harmful. So to study this use mention distinction and how it impacts downstream tasks, we looked into pairs of hate speech and counter speech statements. So to give you an example, if the intention of the user is to state hate speech, they might say, I'm tired of women taking part to political debate. Feminism is a divisive force in society, where this phrase is used offensively. But then if the goal is to challenge hate speech, a user might say, of course, if you've never read anything about feminism, then you will believe that feminism is a divisive force, which again mentions this entire phrase. But the difference is that we would want to detect uses as hateful, but we wouldn't want to detect counter speech mentions as hateful because of the potential of counter speech to make a difference out there in the online spaces. So to figure out what is happening here and how this issue could be addressed, we formalized 2 tasks. So first task is use mention classification, where given a text, the goal is to classify whether harmful language is used or mentioned. And then second task is downstream classification, so hateful or not, misinformative or not, given the use mention distinction there. And here my hypothesis was that failures in use mention distinction cause downstream failures. And so testing this, first I found that even the most recent models sometimes fail to distinguish use from mention in counter speech. So for example, GPT-4 would mistake mention for use in over 20% of, in 20 or over 20% of instances. And then more importantly, looking into how that impacts downstream tasks, we see that failure in distinguishing use from mention do propagate to downstream tasks. So when use mention classification is not correct, we have significantly more errors downstream than we have when the classification is correct. And I think this really highlights the importance of this use mention distinction in modeling online language and in modeling counter speech. But I started talking about this phenomenon with this intention of solving the problem. So then my next hypothesis was, if there are these issues, could downstream performance be improved by teaching the use mention distinction through prompting? So we started from simple prompting, where you might say, this is what hate speech means for me. Is this hate speech or not? And then we revised those prompts to include the definition of use mention distinction, examples of used and mentioned language, and then do a chain of thought, step-by-step prompting, where we say, let's think step by step, and let's first do use mention classification, and then let's do the downstream classification. And then we saw that this indeed helps. So if you look at GPT-4, you would want to have low counter-speech false positive rate, but you would want to have high true use positive rate, which is the trade-off that David was asking about. So GPT-4 is already kind of good. So it has 20% counter-speech false positive rate. But then when we do the mitigation, we decrease the false positives even more, without significant true use positive rates. And this is amazing to think that this is possible just by prompting more carefully and embedding these linguistic concepts in the way how we interact with these models. I also wanted to talk a bit about implications for content moderation more broadly. So I think many of the identified limitations of the existing detection models or hate speech models have to do with use-mention distinction. So for example, in the literature, it has been reported that the mere fact that a post contains swear words or identity terms or dialect markers can lead to misclassification. And I think that this is linked to use-mention distinction because if models end up just being triggered by keywords, then they act more like topic models and not really taking into account the use-mention distinction and the intention of users. So I think in the future, it will be important to figure out how do we prevent these models from being surface topic classifiers. Yeah.
So how much do you think it has to do with how annotators annotate these content on which the models are trained? Because annotators also look at these keywords and they're like, if they're MTurkers, they have a certain number of annotations to finish and they just want to get through it.
Yeah, that's my next slide. Yes, so I think that this exactly happens because I think there is a need to fix how we collect annotations. So when we looked into some of the frequently used data sets of hate speech and toxicity, they would often have mentioning statements labeled as hateful, which means that humans labeled it as such. And I think that this happens because typical hate speech instructions don't specify what to do with counter speech and what to do with mentioning statements. So typical instructions would say, does the above text contain rude, hateful, aggressive, or otherwise unreasonable language? But that doesn't say what to do with mentioning statements. And then annotators with different background or different positionality can interpret that in different ways. And that leads to that kind of disagreement. But I think here, the implication for me is that we should rethink how we collect the data. So moderation guidelines and annotation guidelines. And I'm also optimistic about teaching linguistic concepts as part of interacting with models. And I think for me, that shows that if we're more careful, we can make sure that AI is fostering constructive conversations and not silencing. Yeah.
But maybe even mentions can have harmful effects, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
Maybe can you measure that?
Yes, that's something I'm very interested in the future work. Yeah, I'll have one slide. Okay. Okay, cool. So for the last few minutes, I wanted to, so I talked about content moderation and some of the challenges and some of the ways to address these challenges, but I also wanted to go high level and come back to this high level question of how could we identify and address harms when developing AI for social good and what that could mean in other domains where we could help humans, but there are also some risks. So I wanted to briefly talk about two other domains, educational and emotional support and sustainability. So I'm interested in educational and emotional support because in these domains, human supporters, especially when they do their job online, are not provided with a lot of resources and they're typically understaffed and there are just so many people to help. And so here I'm interested in this question of whether LLMs could help as part of the training or as part of developing your skills or practicing doing this job of online tutoring or online therapy. So the question is, how could LLMs serve as simulated support providers for training emotional supporters? And here, so in both education domain and therapy domain, when humans do this job, we are very good in using conversation to build a common ground. So we would ask a lot of clarification questions, a lot of follow-up questions, a lot of acknowledgements, a lot of nodding, and that is a way to build understanding and to build common ground with the listener. But one problem might be that LLM generations might not reflect those efforts to build a common ground. So for example, if a support seeker says, I don't have close friends because I don't trust people, a human supporter would try to clarify, like, what do you mean? You don't trust family or you don't trust people in general? But perhaps if we use an LLM could just jump straight to the advice and say, I understand that feeling, building trust with others could be tough. And that would be undesirable, because if there are no efforts to build common ground, then there could be misunderstandings and even catastrophic outcomes. Yeah.
What if we adapt the LM to the community? Would that build up more common ground to the members of the community?
Yes, totally. Okay, so one thing that we saw is that if you take like many of the typical data sets used for aligning these models, like for RLHF, that signal preferences around what is preferred and dispreferred. And then if you train on those data sets, as the training progresses, you see less and less, you see more of a decrease in the rates of using these dialogue acts, and also less of an agreement with how humans use grounding. And I think that's definitely the case. So we want to have these general chat models that are aligned with like general data sets specifying preferences. But I'm in general interested in this question of like, how do we solve that? How do we more closely reflect human grounding? And I think that, like not tuning on like general purpose preference data sets, but instead having like better data sets for education or for therapy, and like really signaling that asking questions is preferred and not dispreferred could be one way to achieve. Yeah, is that what you meant? Like more closely modeling like the community?
Yeah, yeah.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. So that's one thing I'm definitely interested in. Okay. And then last few minutes, I also wanted to talk about sustainability. So I've been working for years on data science and AI for modeling and changing dietary behaviors. And here I'm very interested in plant-based diets. So plant-based diets are great for our health and great for the environment, but there are still some big barriers to the adoption of plant-based food. So if we ask people why they're not switching to a full plant-based diet, they would talk about taste concerns, where there are concerns that this food is just not going to be tasty, or preparation concerns, where it might be like very complex to plan and execute these recipes. And we even talked to chefs at Stanford about what happens when they prepare plant-based food. And they spoke about how when they do that, it feels like solving a puzzle, they would say, where they need to think about whether students will like this food. They need to think about nutrition, sustainability, cost, preparation time. So it's really like solving a puzzle. So one question I'm interested in is how could LLMs help mitigate some of the challenges people face when planning and preparing plant-based food? So one concrete proposal could be, imagine if it's you, an amateur chef or a professional chef, could an AI model, so like a computational model of taste, like a simulated taster that given a recipe model's taste, could it help facilitate this iterative recipe generation? Or the other, could a simulated chef, so a generative model that given ingredients makes a recipe that meets the constraints, could that support recipe generation while meeting all these complex constraints that the chefs that we talked to were talking about? And here in this domain of applying LLMs to food, one recent work that we have also shows that there are some risks. So if we are generating recipes, we want to generate diverse recipes that can work for everyone. But in this recent work, we saw that if we, for example, use LLMs to generate synthetic restaurant reviews, LLMs can reproduce some of the same societal biases that humans have. So LLMs could describe Italian restaurants as breathtaking and classic, but then immigrant non-European cuisine, such as Chinese in the US, would be described as usual, authentic, and also clean, which is a very othering frame focusing on hygiene, which can be very harmful. And so one question I'm interested in is how could we address these biases? How could we mitigate them? And how could we really assist humans in preparing recipes?
Sorry, so how do you And I've seen this in other papers from Dan Jurowski, when you focus on these words. And
Yeah.
so my first question is, how do you identify them and how do you categorize them? You said breathtaking and classic as, being more positive in the sense, in comparison to usual, authentic, and clean. So how do you sort of come up with a classification of these words?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did like a lexicon-based approach where we sort of started top down from, like, we had some hypotheses about like what is described in the literature, like how humans are biased when they evaluate foreign cuisines, like prestige bias, othering frames that focus on like price and authenticity. And so we had some like solid hypotheses. We also did exploratory work, but we had hypotheses about what to look for. And then concretely, we started from some seed terms, like let's say like clean, but there are many other terms, right, that could pop up. And then we expanded those lexicons. And so that's how we captured them. Yeah, thanks. Okay, great. That was my last slide. I wanted to conclude on a positive note. So I just wanted to say that I think there are some amazing opportunities to apply these LLMs to these high stakes domains, such as content moderation, education, emotional support, sustainability, and really help humans with like very complex things that we're doing. I also think that in the process, identifying and mitigating harms will be crucial. But then if we get it right, we'll have a lot more than entertaining web interfaces, but really safe core technology that we can use in all of these domains. And thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take more questions. And I also wanted to thank my collaborators, mentors, and founders, including Swiss National Science Foundation and Stanford HAI. Thank you. Could I address your question maybe about?
Sure.
Yeah, it's something that I was thinking about a lot. So yeah, I was just reading recently. So like not all counter speech needs to even mention problematic language, and there are different counter speech strategies. So there is this recent work with really good examples and the taxonomy of like how to write counter speech. So if like you want to counter a stereotype that women are shallow, you can do it by talking about external factors, like there are so many issues in the society and they perpetuate false stereotypes. And then you might say, false stereotype that women are shallow, where you're really mentioning this phrase, women are shallow. But then there are also other ways to do that, where you might give a counterexample. So you might say, you might not say women are shallow, but like say something like women are profound without explicitly reinforcing that stereotype and explicitly mentioning those same phrases. And I think that this is important, like especially linked to all this work about like metaphors and how we make sense of the world through metaphors. And then in that literature, they talk about how you can't negate a frame. So once you say women are not shallow, you just make association women shallow and you can't negate the frame. And so perhaps like that's not the way to do that. So I think in the future, one question I'm interested in is like, what are these different counter speech strategies? Do they need to mention harmful language? And then also how effective are they? Yeah.
Yeah, and on that note, like I think in my experience, it's like what I know with the eating disorder community, I just realized the anti-eating disorder community are even more toxic than the pro-ED community, because I feel like oftentimes if you need to say something that's controversial, they need to up their dramatic, they need to up their toxicity so people can hear their voice. So I think this is very interesting that we can even educate an application. We can educate how the anti community, they can have better counter speech strategies, better to raise their voice effectively without, I guess, perpetuating toxicity.
Yeah, I love that. And I totally agree, because counter speech can address any type of problematic language. And so one can be like eating disorder and like how counter speech to that, and how do you do that effectively, and how do you do it so that it doesn't backfire, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think to follow up on that is I just submitted a paper that I shared with you on exactly that issue, that there's often counter speech that's very, very toxic. Sometimes it's effective, but whether it actually improves things in the long term is absolutely up for debate and probably unlikely to happen. And I think it's because counter speech is often driven by either moral framing or strong emotions, because these people have very strong opinions about things that are right or wrong, of course.
And then we could think about, well, is there a more effective strategy? Of course, you're mentioning this paper, and as I recall from reading it, they were surveying people, but how it actually works in practice, it remains to be seen. It'd be very interesting to see whether logic or using reframing morals or reframing emotions, like it's moral for you to treat women with dignity, you know, or something like that. I don't know. Could be an effective strategy too. So yeah, I really like this idea, and I'll love to talk to you about that too.
Yeah, definitely. And then also tailoring to the domain, because I imagine that not all strategies are equally successful for like gender stereotypes or eating disorders.
Yes, exactly. I mean, so as I shared with you, or I don't think I shared with you, I've done work on detecting like the different types of hate. And we found that there are three broad categories of misogyny, anti-LGBTQ, and racism. And in trying to think about what would be the appropriate counter speech, they differ by the category. Moral framing, you could against people who are racist, I think would be fundamentally different than those who are misogynistic or who are anti-LGBTQ.
Yeah, and I expect that there would be so much to learn from like literature on framing, and especially like, you know, just like campaigns to showcase women and like how like social justice movements have been communicating in the last decades and like what works and what doesn't work. And yeah, I think these kinds of statements like women are profound, more likely to be successful.
Laura, are there any questions online?
Someone wants to know if they want to connect with you more in-depth questions. What's the best way to reach you? Email?
Email.
Okay, that's it.
Can you put your email up on the slides?
Yes.
I can send it to everyone here in the chat.
Yes, it's on the slide.
Yeah, I'm here.
Any other questions? Okay.
Yeah, I thought that was really fascinating. I loved your thoughtful causal analyses of what's going on here, because that's like so rare to see in NLP, I think. I am curious, like thinking in the future, if some of these moderation techniques become used, how will speech evolve in a way to like continue to evade or continue to like exist in a malicious form? And a specific example, in news, we talked about use case versus mention.
Yeah.
I mean, mention in news has really evolved in a way to be impartial and objective, but to still border on use. Journalists use quotes a lot for a use objective rather than a mention objective. So like, I guess that's one example in which like a community might do more mentions in order to evade the kind of moderation.
Yes.
So I kind of wondered, even in the ideal world where like LLMs get better at identifying mentions and better at identifying kind of disclosures, like people might still evolve and adapt.
Yeah, I love those points. I totally agree. Yeah, and in journalism, just to add to that, I know that like sometimes it's even like controversial and different journalists might disagree like about racial slurs and like who gets to use even when it's mentioned, right? And then there's the whole question of like language evolving. So I think one specific use case where that becomes very interesting is this concept of dog whistles. So like hate, where like the one group has secret code terms to mean something that the outgroup wouldn't know about. And so there we've been experimenting with like detecting them, but then there are a lot of issues of like, what does that even mean? Because once it's out there, what it means, the community changes their language and then they come up with new dog whistles. And so it's like a moving target kind of task. So I think this kind of language evolving, it happens in dog whistles, but also in general with problematic online language. So if we use LLMs, for sure, it's not static, like you build a model today and you use it forever. So for sure, as community language evolves, there is also the need to update your classifiers. And I also think, so that's something that I'm very interested to look into. And then especially to look into that in the setting where humans interact with language models, where language models then at the meta level also have like also represent some writing styles, you know, where like some phrases are used, like let's say happy to help. But then like if like you interact with a language model a lot, like what does that mean? Like how will humans change in how we use the phrase happy to help. So you know what I mean? It's like changing language of communities, but then we are also interacting with language models that like emulate. So I think that's fascinating.
I'm going to make a prediction that humans are going to not use the word please anymore. We're so used to not telling please to ChatGPT.
Well,
But actually, quick question. Yeah.
So you said that there's some form of over flagging, right?
Yeah.
But it sort of depends on what community you're flagging from as well, right? Like if you're looking at some posts in a community that's not meant like under 18 or under 21,
Yes.
then you would want to flag those content. You wouldn't want them to see any sort of harm. So how would you sort of go about tailoring different policies for different communities, or how would you go about that?
Yes, so I made a statement about what happens like at aggregate level, like all the users. And then, as I said, I think that reflects more like the majority group. So I don't control for that. But yeah, if like one community overflags, that doesn't mean, so maybe another community underflags, you know. So I think that's really important to take into account. And yeah, like how do we do that? And then particularly also when it comes to counter speech, I think if we're serious about like really figuring out which strategies work and like what works according to whom, it would be so important to like recruit like targets of problematic language and not just like any person on any platform. So I think, yeah, thinking more carefully, like who is the source, what is the intention, who is the audience, and yeah, getting that right is crucial.
Intent and impact, right? You know, the differences. All right, well, I want to keep people here. We try to keep on schedule, so let's thank the speaker for this amazing talk. And next week there'll be another seminar whose name I forgot, but
Be here next week.
that was
Thank you for your question.